Stuart and I initially made no connection between what we had done and solving the so-called digital cash problem. Because as it was thought of then, this is all pre-Satoshi. And again, I think of this as the David Chaum era.
Right.
It was about two problems: anonymizing and avoiding the double spend problem.
Correct.
Something is spent here, somehow it has to know that it can't be respent there.
Right.
Which has this quantum entanglement kind of feeling to it.
A little bit.
And so that's where our mindset was. And so first to the anonymity issue. It's really not. In fact, you have a terrific chain of custody. You have something that's almost exactly the opposite of anonymity.
Right.
In the Bitcoin solution.
Well, actually, I'd read I've been looking for it again, but there were some big data experts at Carnegie Mellon who actually started looking at the Bitcoin and the data there, and they said that they can actually identify probably about 35%.
I've read that analysis, yeah.
So, and that was like 2 years ago that was. I'm sure that it at some point, because you have this permanent record.
Right.
You know, it's not like you can disappear into the ether.
Right.
It's
right.
there, and
right.
you know they can triangulate and figure these things out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the anonymity was not addressed. Similarly, the double spend problem really is not addressed. Now, this is where I would take even more flack, because do I understand that you can't spend the money twice? Sure, I understand that. But why? It's because we've got a single record.
Right.
Now, the record is replicated widely, but having a single record and saying in that single record, can you spend the money twice? Everyone knows that if all you had was a single record, that you couldn't spend money twice.
That's correct.
And so in both cases, it sort of sidestepped what we saw as the issue. And so what really emerged was that he had this idea of making the ledger public and making it about money. And
restricting it to money.
Restricting it to money.
Right.
Making its focus money.
Right.
I give you this, you give that person that, they give
right.
this
And that's
person
why you didn't have the
that.
connection between documents and money.
And that was really the issue. And it really goes to the heart of something. And again, I know that there are those who disagree with me, and I can respect that. But I'm more right than they are. And, at some point that will come out. What I came to understand is that money and cash are really very, very different. And that what we really are talking about is money and not cash. Okay. And there's this terrific statement from someone at the Federal Reserve I think, head of research for the, what's the unit in St. Louis of the Federal Reserve?
Fred?
Well, no matter. Anyway, he says, when it comes down to it, he's talking about the Fed and fiat currencies as opposed to Bitcoin.
Right.
And he says, when it comes down to it, all money is just a ledger.
Oh, right. I've read that quote many times.
And that's a very powerful quote. And that's where it kind of crystallized in my mind.
Versus currency.
Versus
money is a ledger.
Current.
Currency is something physical.
Right. That what we had was just a ledger that, for whatever mathematical or cryptographic reasons, was able to muster enough trust among a certain community that they were willing to treat it as the ledger. And that's really the only requirement for money, is a community that
will accept it.
That is led to accept that ledger as the correct record of transactions.
Sure, a barter community could have something entirely different as long as the community agrees upon it. It is a form of currency.
Right. And so that really tells you something about the interplay, and this is, I think, where a lot of the value add will come in the future, between the technical foundations and the level of confidence that it inspires and enables in a community.
Right.
It is not that we rely in some fundamental sense on the cryptography. And again, I understand how the math works, so just parse my words carefully here. It's that we are persuaded as a community that it meets our requirements. And so we instill it with our confidence and
Right.
trust.
Right.
And so the reason that I think it's so important to parse that is it suggests the course for future fiat but non-sovereign currencies. It is not necessarily that they have to do something mathematically that is, in some sense, completely airtight. It's that they have to do enough to persuade a community to begin to make use of it.
Well, it's the old argument of what makes the internet. It's the network itself. I mean, that
Yeah,
was the old Oracle argument. It's that once the network is large enough, then it does have validation in the network.
right.
And you then have a large enough community that it's actually using whatever the asset be, whether it's Bitcoin or another digital coin, that it has acceptance
Right.
and usability. So some of the things you said is that you weren't happy with. So the surprises were uh, the resolution of some of the primary problems as it related to currency, money. What was the things that you're still disappointed with Bitcoin?
Well, again, I've been somewhat vocal about this, and that is fundamentally proof of work is not the right consensus mechanism.
Well, it's an expensive and
Very
slow.
expensive, um, slow depending on how you implement the thing, but it
Sure,
creates an arms race that is, in a sense, unbounded but by the economic equilibrium
sure.
that people are willing to sustain. And other than that, um, it's not creating economic value. Now, I say other than that because certainly I've read papers that say, well, it costs a lot, but if it creates economic value that's justified by the cost, then sure, I get that. But again, I don't mean it in a negative way. What I mean it is in the sense that it tells us where to look for successors and improvements to the
So
system.
when you're thinking about that, what are the missing elements to the technology, at least from your perspective at this moment?
Well, again, let's be clear, my opinion about Bitcoin considered as a whole.
Okay.
Okay. It is a tour de force. It is a bravura performance. It's a terrific bringing together of some things.
Right.
Um, that doesn't mean that it's the right or final solution. And it's really more like the opening act, if you will. There's this.
Is this a three-act play or is this the opening
This is a
quarter?
multi-act play.
Multi-act play,
Okay.
okay.
Um, there's this joke from Samuel Johnson, who was the.
Economist.
Well, I'm talking about an earlier Samuel Johnson, who
Okay.
was an English man of letters.
Okay.
And he says something like this. He says, when you see a dog dancing on its hind legs, it's not that it does it well, it's that it can do it at
At all,
all.
right.
And that's really what I think, that's how we have to applaud Bitcoin, that it definitely got the ball over the net.
Mm,
And it has become the first candidate for a viable fiat currency that is not a sovereign currency.
exactly.
Okay. But it is, in my opinion, by no means the final story. And again, if you wanted to cut to the chase, um, we talk about money in the classical sense as having three characteristics. It's a medium of exchange, it's a unit of account, it's a store of value. Um, the reason that there's so much emphasis, in my opinion, retroactively on Bitcoin as store of value is simply because it's failed in the first two
Right.
categories. And so this is the only thing kind of left. Again, it was against long odds. It had, initially no reason for people wanting to exchange it.
Right.
Okay. And yet it has found, some level of sustainability. So again, I don't want to get hate mail from people telling me that I've missed Satoshi's vision and I don't get it and that I don't have libertarian ideals myself, which I do. But it's the opening act, and I applaud it, but it's not the whole story, not even close.
So then, what is the missing elements? I mean, I often describe in the courses I teach that Bitcoin is generation one blockchain, and then I continue that argument by saying Ethereum is like Gen 2, Hyperledger is like 2.5. There's a debate as to what Gen 3 really is, but then there's like these Gen 4s that I refer to as Gen 4s, like EOS as an example, where you're starting to get better controls, better governance models, alternative consensus mechanisms. They seem to have solved some of the problems with regards to mining by limiting things down. And then I hear about, Akamai, the streaming service for the internet. They've come out with something that they're working with Mitsubishi Bank in Japan, capability of 10 million transactions per second. Now, I've often argued that that's really the definition between all of these things, with the addition of governance models. But what is it that's missing from all of these, because they're all in their infancy? What is missing to actually make these truly enterprise grade platforms where, I mean, when I first started training in blockchain in 2016, everyone was doing their POCs. In 2017, they said, oh, we're just continuing them for implementation in 2018. And of course, by 2018, the crypto market actually came and collapsed. Nothing happened. We're now in 2019 and we're still saying to ourselves, where's the enterprise rollouts? So what's missing?
It's a great question, but I would actually rephrase it.
Okay.
First, the thing that I would say is that what makes a blockchain is an interlinked set of records that are widely distributed.
Okay.
That is an essential foundation no matter what one does. Widely distributed enough, where widely distributed really means among a broad enough group that the possibility of collusion becomes, de minimis.
Right.
Okay. On top of that, you have to make at least three design decisions. Okay. One is, where should what kinds of computation take place? And there's a tension between centralizing computation versus widely distributing it. But it is a fundamentally different decision than the absolute requisite of distributing the records.
Correct.
And this commingling of records and computation and assuming that both have to take place at the periphery is, I think, one of the fundamental misunderstandings of people that continue to work in this space. Not just a design flaw.
So
but
is it a design flaw as it is currently deployed?
Well, first of all, it's deployed in many, many different ways.
Right.
Okay, if we're now speaking beyond Bitcoin.
Right.
And to me, I don't want to so much call it a design flaw as to say that it is not a fundamental requirement. What is a fundamental requirement is a wide distribution of the record.
Right.
The wide distribution of the computation and what kind of computation needs to be distributed widely and what kind of computation can be handled more efficiently centrally without violating the fundamental peer-to-peer nature of the system needs to be handled on a much more fine-tuned or more granular scale, examining the particular use cases and whatnot.
Right.
And I think to the extent that people have blinders on and think that wherever the records are distributed, the computation must also occur, I think they're missing a major portion of the design space that's open.
The aspect of a blockchain is the different roles that miners play, or nodes. You can have
Nodes.
mining nodes as well as validation nodes.
Right.
You could have a core set of mining nodes, but have widely distributed validation nodes.
Yeah, and so yes, what you're saying is sound in my opinion. I think it goes farther, but it might be getting a little theoretical to try to take it beyond that. But the gist of that, I am very much with. The decision about consensus, or to call it differently, decisions about governance, the fact that they, in the Bitcoin paper, were intertwined with intensive computation, that also is a little bit of a blinders thing. Or to put it, maybe more, to state it in a more positive way, in physics, you talk about a phase space, all of the degrees of freedom that you have that allow you to design. And with blockchain, we have a design space, let's say. There's a governance axis, there's a distributed computation axis, maybe there's a third axis. Satoshi picked a particular point in that three-dimensional space that was very extreme, off in one far corner of the design space. Okay? Whereas the entire space is open to our working in. And as we get more and more comfortable with separating kind of the signal from the noise as to what's essential about blockchain and what is simply one species of blockchain in the Bitcoin animal, then we open up our vision as to how wide the design space is. So with that as preface, now I want to come back to your question. You said, what's missing?
Right.
I want to rephrase that. And that is, what problem needs solving? Okay. What economically driven or socially driven problem actually needs solving? And where in the design space can we find its solution?
Right.
And the issue will differ from problem to problem.
Right.
There are a number of problems that blockchain and what can be built on top of it. And again, I'm talking about sort of proto-blockchain. Blockchain, in my opinion, in its essence.
Right.
And not just Bitcoin.
Right.
But this peer-to-peering of trust, this decentralization of authority, if not control. And those are two different things. That's this broad design space. Now it's a technology. And now it has to obey the same rules that all other technologies, which end up becoming widely used, have to obey. Namely, they have to solve an actual problem, and they have to solve it better for the people that actually want to use it in order for it to gain adoption.